Alrighty guys, today we are back to talking about both Nintendo and emulators, but surprisingly this has nothing to do with Nintendo's legal stance on the matter and is much more to do with software limitations when it comes to emulating the classics. N64 emulation today is plagued with legacy problems which can be traced all the way back to the dawn of the console's emulation story. Back in the early 2000s, PCs simply weren't powerful enough to reproduce the N64's performance correctly, so developers had to resort to using plugins to improve things. In fact, the lack of accessibility to N64 titles is what struck my interest in emulating the console in the first place, as that is a huge piece of gaming history that really doesn't deserve to be lost to time. Hello fellow travelers and welcome to the Hard Light Network. Alrighty guys, today we are back to talking about both Nintendo and emulators, but surprisingly this has nothing to do with Nintendo's legal stance on the matter and is much more to do with software limitations when it comes to emulating the classics. In fact, I'd say the only thing more unfortunate than the difficulty surrounding the emulation of N64 titles is the fact that you do not get the satisfaction of blowing down the cartridge before playing. In fact, there's no huffing or puffing that'll solve the software emulation problems that we're going to talk about today. But before we get into it, guys, I'd like to ask you to hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the content we've got coming up for you guys in the future, and also hit that comment section with your thoughts down below. Also, if you guys are interested in supporting the channel further, there are super thanks and memberships options down below. Feel free to join the channel for access to exclusive content and perks that you can't get anywhere else. But without any further ado, let's get into today's article. And our article today does come to us from TimeExtension.com and is entitled, "Why is N64 so hard to emulate in 2025? Modern Vintage Gamer Investigates." Emulation has unlocked many classic systems for a whole new generation of players, and devices such as handhelds, microconsoles, the Nintendo Switch, emulation boxes, and Mr. FPGA have made connecting with the past easier than ever before. However, it's wrong to blindly assume that all platforms are emulated equally based purely on their age. For example, PS1 emulation is in a really good place these days, offering accurate performance and bonus features such as upscaled visuals. Likewise, Dreamcast emulation is robust even on lower level devices thanks to the console's PC-like architecture. However, the N64, which launched a few years before the Dreamcast, is still a hit-and-miss affair, and Modern Vintage Gamer has released a new video that explores why that is the case. N64 emulation today is plagued with legacy problems which can be traced all the way back to the dawn of the console's emulation story. Back in the early 2000s, PCs simply weren't powerful enough to reproduce the N64's performance correctly, so developers had to resort to using plugins to improve things. This was often done on a game-by-game basis, so while big hitters in the console's library reached good levels of performance, more obscure games suffered. Even today, many of these legacy problems are present when playing on modern hardware which should be powerful enough to provide accurate N64 emulation. Even Nintendo N64's emulator on Switch has issues with timing and overall accuracy. Although, as Modern Vintage Gamer notes, you'll probably only notice if you're compared directly with the real thing. The conclusion is that the N64 emulation needs a real shake-up in order to eradicate the issues of the past, with a new emulation solution required that faithfully replicates all of the console's architecture without using plugins to paper over the cracks. Even FPGA options, such as the Mr. FPGA and the forthcoming Analog 3D, are unlikely to offer a totally accurate degree of performance, says Modern Vintage Gamer. What do you make of the state of the N64 emulation currently? Let us know with a comment. And that is going to do it for the body of the article, but before we get into the comments section, I'd like to discuss things a little further on my own. Personally, and much like the article stated, my personal contention with emulation has less to do with the performance and more to do with the selection of games available. Full disclosure, I recently purchased an emulator to augment my personal library of retro and classic games. and also so that I might share these games with my children. However, upon booting up the system, I immediately recognized that the majority of the 20,000 plus games that were preloaded onto the system were actually not in English, which really wasn't that big of a deal considering that most of these games are older, and by virtue of being older, they're pretty simple games with pretty simple control schemes. Not to mention, they're not very hard to navigate, and honestly, even though a lot of the games were repeats, considering each one was separated by individual language, it was still good to be able to access a bunch of classic and retro titles that I couldn't purchase anywhere else. Despite the wide selection of games available, I did immediately notice the lack of N64 titles, which is to say, there were none. Thankfully, I do have my very own N64 system. However, like I've mentioned in earlier videos, select cartridges for the console are getting increasingly expensive to purchase. And while the less popular titles can still be purchased anywhere from $10 to $20, that's assuming you can find them. In fact, the lack of accessibility to N64 titles is what struck my interest in emulating the console in the first place, as that is a huge piece of gaming history that really doesn't deserve to be lost to time. The N64 was a famously robust console, and even now, nearly 30 years after its initial release, there are many titles that are still worth playing to this day. If you haven't played the original ports of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Banjo-Kazooie, or Conker's Bad Fur Day, you're missing out on an amazing series of titles. And to tell you the truth, us older gamers really owe it to the newer generation of gamers to preserve these experiences for them. But that being said, we do have a few comments to read from the bottom section of this article before we wrap up this video. While there are a few dozen comments under this article, I've distilled it down to a handful that I feel like accurately discuss the problems involved here. And we will begin the comments with Ginger Beard Man, who says, "I'm unconvinced by the arguments presented in the MVG video. Feels like half-hearted and incomplete reasons, with some hand-waving and trust me going on. A lot of things are repeated and badly worded, and none of it is quite convincing enough in my honest opinion. Plugins alone don't explain the poor standard of N64 emulation. They were just a way of dividing the work/complexity and allowing multiple people to tackle it in their own way to see what approach works best/better, like shaders in today's emulation scene. The original N64 hardware and software setup is very complicated. RSP, microcode, RDRAM, floating point behavior, weird timings, and the effort has yet to be put in to cover it all with sufficient detail. The 3-point texture sampling/filtering has long been solved, but MVG words things as if it hasn't been. Whether N64 emulation can be done well, performantly, on modern systems remains unanswered." Next up is Bulk Slash, who says, "The issue isn't with games like Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time. It's when you try playing something really obscure that hardly anyone plays that you will find graphical and accuracy issues. The most obvious timing issues with the Switch N64 emulator is the ending sequences to Ocarina of Time and Mario Kart 64. The ending visuals flash before the music does on both because it doesn't accurately emulate the slowdown in certain parts. In the case of Ocarina of Time, it cuts the music off. In Mario Kart, Mario talks over the music." Then we have Coalescence, who says, "Always the comments of, I played the really popular games that have gotten the most support fine, therefore all N64 emulation is perfect. Glad others pointed out the real problem. Everyone thought since they had the previous consoles hacked together in parts just fine that the N64 would be a cinch using the same approach. It needs a dedicated focus on every game because every game could bring something new to the table. But so long as every dingus playing Mario 64 perpetuates the idea that it's fine as is." We've also got King Mike with a two-parter that says, "Because it's not nearly as popular as the NES, Super NES, or Game Boy, so much of the research and development has been propped up by a few superfans. Plugins weren't an issue of power. It was a concept of emulator authors splitting the workload like, oh, I'll work on the CPU, and someone else can work on the graphics, and we can just slam our work together. Easy, right?" Finally, we have Crambo42, who says, "I'm pretty new to emulation. N64 has given me more issues than NES, SNES, GB, GBA, Genesis, 2600, and 7800, but it really hasn't been so bad. Some games take a bit of poking around in the emulator settings, and maybe they don't run exactly like I'd like them to. But hey, they seem pretty good to me. I've actually been pleasantly surprised by how well most of them run after years of hearing about how hard they are to emulate. Dolphin, on the other hand, has been incredibly disappointing. I don't even bother with the GC/Wii anymore. I just play on my Wii U. But that's going to do it for this video, guys. Thank you so much to everybody who has watched up to this point. If you can, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the content that I've got coming up for you guys in the future. Also, please feel free to take to the comment section down below with your thoughts on N64 emulation. At some point in the near future, I have an interview coming up with one of my coworkers who has done some incredible work on emulating many titles from many different consoles. The man has a veritable library of Babylon when it comes to emulating consoles on a variety of different pieces of hardware. As of right now, this stream is slated to be a members-only video, but I may be releasing part of the interview for regular audiences. Thank you so much to everybody who has watched up to this point, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the members-only channel when it comes to that interview. But as always, thank you guys for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like, and until next time, love you guys, safe travels.